Insights into David Chac by Otfag. Some of you might not know who David Chac is, but I'll give a rough introduction. He is a 28-year-old, likely misdiagnosed, Asperger syndrome sufferer who has developed a self-aggrandizing ideology, binarizing his quote-unquote own misassociated ilk into racially and spiritually godhood-anointed indigo children of the ancient Aryan steppes of the northern India. He has spent years, a sad amount of time, meticulously crafting feel-good lies, misinterpreting autism research to confirm his own biases, and oversimplifying to the point of caricature the behaviours and attitudes of various races of the world. Half of the Skype calls he had made to me were about his impressions of these strawmen, so that he can better understand those well-documented statistical features too mystifying for his Christianesque intellectual profile to grapple with. He has also engaged in his own decades-long love quest to find some imbecile with which to procreate, to be successful in such a task recently, making him an effective normal fag. This woman, from all indications, has been made enough excuses for by Chac that I have reason to suspect she has hardly any capacity to look after herself, and David is effectively exploiting that situation. It is also to repeat a cycle of history that a disabled predator, in his father's case the disability being of his own making, inducing a stroke on purpose, would use that pretext with which to employ his wiles in ensnaring some PDD-NOS tabula rasa rote automaton, or in his father's case, to entrap a schizophrenic wild card, such that was David Chac's mother. A little bit of interesting history about the Chacs that I got from an actual Ukrainian. They were misfits and outcasts who weren't even assimilated or accepted by David's beloved Karpati. No, looking at Soviet morphological reliefs, one can see the disresemblance. David looks more like one of the Anatols that were expelled from the region after a long deluge of antisocial abuse, disorder and destruction wrought by the congenital lumpen proletarian rejects that comprise the Chac clan. Severe psychopathy truly does exist in that lineage, which I will go on to elucidate later. This will have run-on sentences which are mostly deliberate. Driving home the point of his ill mind requires circuitous rationale, which can't be explicated all too clearly, since it isn't all too free of mystifying ideas. I have, if anything, been caught up in the process of trying to demystify those ideas before you accuse me of pretension. My brain isn't exactly systematized for psychoanalytic babbling, if you hadn't figured out already. That was David's rather Semitically inspired expertise. And any obfuscation is the result of my brain running in overdrive trying to unravel his conniving ways. Anything that's unclear, instead of attacking it meretriciously on literary merit, just ask me for clarification by sending off a message to my email. You might catch me in a better mood when I'm able to think clearer. In recent email exchanges with David Chac, some extremely hilarious things have transpired, which all reveal a certain hypocritical, negrid Semititude in his world outlook that is exemplary of a deeply rooted evil and an incompetence commensurate with his malice. It is not gaining credibility among the Mossad janitor trolling circles, to quote him, when he conveniently applies the same feminine social strategization in trying to butter up the shoulders of those moderating the Asperger groups on Facebook, which, despite being known for an ideological disrepute that David was just cognizant enough to perceive, no, often he doesn't so much as perceive or analyze the obvious, instead receding into a self-absorbed, idealistic logical realm, where he exists solely in the confines of the extrapolation of nebulous statements, like some sort of Canarian, pseudo-autistic schizophrenic possessed by demonic forces. He nonetheless ignores this for the so-called good. In the same way the state thought it fitting to let him run with wild abandon and preying upon mentally retarded women to turn them into his vicarious transvestitic male voyeuristic fetishism objects, that is, in the vein of that modal self-serving hypocritical morality of the state he feigns detestation of, despite knowing full well that it is where psychopaths like himself that he reflects with full bureaucratic slipshoddity, married to a predilection in taking perverse pleasure in demonizing and villainizing people, using his own internal manipulation strategies as templates with which to paste these libellous statements of pseudo-analysis against his self-made enemies. Not that he takes responsibility for initiating the embitterment of relations between people, imagining those critical of him to be secretly fearful or impressed by his resilience, retard persistent, of finding an opportunity to con unsuspecting people out of their own predispositions, whether that is to browbeat, like an Irish crony cop, false attestations out of retarded Native Americans in order to falsify a profile of evidence with which to smear his foe, or to gaslight the deficient, prodigal daughters of upper-middle-class non-subhumans in exacting a childishly petulant vengeance against the imagined structures of oppression there associated, neglecting that his inferior G causes enough problems for him without a matriarchy, a petite bourgeoisie, or a nebulous, publicly exhibited feminine essence to oppress himself, let alone anybody who has beguiled, who he has beguiled, into believing that these boogeymen hold any relevance for them. And I speak of the same victim that I've alluded to several times already that he has done this to. Getting back to David's inability to coherently analyse external phenomena unless he has, in his rather dull, uninspired and robotic way, pre-systematised it to make a template which he later imbues upon everything, regardless of context, which is made even more obvious by the lack of citational specificity of his claims, instead making sweeping generalizations and then rather incendiarily trying to accuse you of the same, which has been trademarked as childish Machiavellianism by the trolling circles. He would then require some temerity in order to claim that he can intuit into the deepest recesses of the psychological processes driving the motivations of those he regards as foe, when he was the one who had predated against them in the first place, coming onto IRC and then trying to gaslight everyone into believing they were drunk because he's a gumptious, oblivious idiot, hardly able to conceal his latent aggression manifested in his desire to render true the products of his revenge Sam Vankin style like that, something he knew full well that he was doing only to adumbrate it behind a pseudo-Asperger, retarded self-consciousness embellished oblivion. He wonders why anybody would deign have antipathy towards him. Well, it's probably the only thing he's honestly earned in his life, the grandiosity invested in bolstering his other non-accomplishments aside. This, if anything, would fit a tropical empathizing, or should I say social-spiritual strategizing archetype than a systematizing one, precluding David to any vestige of hypermasculine pretense. It makes his desperate grasping for pseudoscientific draws, with which he could only end up strangling himself in such rash opportunism as to would compel one to engage in such a flimsy ad hoc argument, all the more hilarious. David isn't very reasonable. He's far too defensive to be reasonable. Temple Grandin's adrenaline addiction, before David takes that to affirm his Asperger's, psychopaths also exhibit this trait to a higher degree, and confuses absolute solidified conviction in his position for anything righteous, let alone well defended. I am not against moral absolutism myself, but this is completely devoid of a moral component. This is the autistic child who is throwing a tantrum because the game is not being played on his own terms. But being ultimately just a retard on a neurotypical spectrum, there is another element to this petulant behavior: denial. To sustain a cognitive dissonance between the actuality of David's prevarications and his perceived sense of justice entirely warped by the hypocritical, self-serving morality earlier aforementioned. He cannot let the tables go unturned for a second, lest he surrenders the privilege that being the victim entitles him to go and villainize his target, which will then later be used as a scarecrow to intimidate his pseudo-familiars, prey he predates upon, he understands nothing else, into serving his most depraved sexual desires. Did I mention he was intoxicating the mind of a mentally retarded missing person case by carrying out a forced female to male transition fantasy? I was about to say fail male, which they are. A manipulation instrumental in getting what he wants, for that is the sum, devoid of anything noble, of his overarching goals. No Aspie could reasonably sustain the degree of deflection, projection, and reflection required to undertake such psychic permutations necessary for convincing manipulation. Victor IQ, though, and Rene Racine is a retard, and judging by the quality of his ilk, of which I was probably near the best, if not the best, and not that I'm boasting, I'm actually humiliated by my previous association with such a dreck of his entire chess piece repertoire. He hasn't friends and his partner's a virtual dildo. It is likely that this new thing he has accrued among his possessions can't have much going on upstairs either. He does exceedingly well in pulling the wool over the eyes of the Alex Harpers and Laura Mulveys, neither of whom are known for their prowess in critical thinking, and for that matter, neither are any of his associates, nor are they known for anything except a mawkish sentimentality, its impetus laid bare in disability identitarianism. It is this fucking puerile, autistic victimhood, which I have never have I seen more gall arise out of, the biggest group of undiagnosed, closet psychopaths I've ever had the displeasure of wasting my time with, to feign a vulnerability that would easily eclipse the Holohoaxers. He hasn't gotten to me yet, however. He failed to so much as gaslight me into believing that I was drunk. And I know his secret vindication lies in the concealment of that vicious intent lain in his psychopathic nature, and that, due to its concealment, he derives a one-upmanship from believing that he has rused everyone, including myself, into thinking that doubt, which he holds in the remnants of his conscience about his sincerity, was not merely a reflection of his desire for vengeance, encapsulated by the co-conspiracy to murder his mother, and embodied in the overwhelming sense of freedom he confessed to me that was resultant of the perpetration of that act, showing the true-seated core of his brazenly unjustified to the point of being an implicit admission of that guilty intent which he had carried his mother's murder out. Her only crime was being a schizophrenic, tortured to death by two borderline psychopaths, and to think that as he laughs at this now, this should show you how chilling his cool disregard is to any decent sensitivity completely absent in his conscientious calculus. What plain, run-of-the-mill autist boasts about his mother's death on Skype? Resentment and embitterment. So I wonder how he could possibly think that he could gaslight my memories to be manipulated as an Orwellian revision of fact, which he had ruthlessly pursued to bolster by brutalizing more retarded Amarins through an interrogation and a false representation of evidence, and the encouragement of the suspect, in his mind, with only lip service given to his so-called allegiance to his succor, but no, he views everybody in suspicion, to reciprocate his more falsely represented evidence for false confessions. I refer to Renee's denial that she had ever flown to Heathrow, David Chac omitting and selectively picking disfavourable accounts of my suicide in an attempt to render it less serious than the fiend a Marin psychopath contrived fake overdose. Like you can do that on marijuana, the only thing Renee can get her grubby mitts on worth toking, that Renee claimed she took to elicit sympathy from David. An idiot, with all the desire, but without the ability, wit, or gumption, to calculate his parochial revenge and claim himself the true arbiter of Aspergian tribalism, more as a statement of public, egotistical exhibitionism coupled with a pathological sense of self-identification with people who aren't even his, as I think his actions have demonstrated enough. An incoherent mishmash pseudo-ideology that, as a result of pathological narcissism, he attributes to his own fault, despite the fact I have bared witness to his charlatanistic process of plagiarism, born out of a mixture of the groidic look-at-me behaviour, and you may look at Stormfront for specified examples of that. A spiteful revenge fantasy carried out to reappropriate the monopolization of Asperger's by the Trotskyists to himself, and a desire to validate himself with accreditation, I should say, by the intellectuals who are not merely mainstream but gifted stream to his special item, so as to allow himself the final say to whom the spoils belong, while painting a hackneyed motif falsely characterizing himself in the revolutionary grassroots position. It is so mischievously mendacious that in the internal consistency of these retardation-derived neuroses, he has managed to cultivate unto itself, his own sense of latent inchoate genius. This was the essence of the Sanatan eternalism to which David had espoused, or as the intro man had better put it, retarded persistence. Whatever he tells you, you can be guaranteed it is a minimization, a lie, a twisting of the truth to make himself either appear more sympathizable than he really is, or giving up on this pretense entirely, to intoxicate you with the contagion of his lackluster Negro morality. Entirely a product of the antisocial personality disorder, or as Tommy Sheridan had better put it, autistic sociopathic personality disorder. I now wonder if there are two types of autists on the basis that, just as blacks and mongoloids, in my review of new research, or really old research which has been revisited with better methodology to correct it, have higher than average testosterone levels but different characteristics entirely, so do these quasi-sociopathic cretins, i.e. David, and the passive conformist mongoloid, i.e. myself, and as I think, down to a difference in DHT enzyme activity, his high, mine low. He has paternally inherited. When he excommunicates you from Aspergia, like some sort of closet paedophilic Catholic priest trying to hide his iniquities, upon declaring that you have committed the worst and most apocryphal sin he could apply to you in whatever new ad hoc double standard he has constructed for himself, not only is it a reflection of his ego and pathologically overbearing possessiveness, it equally conveys a certain insecurity in his own position, sort of a tacit admission to the knowledge that, with opposition, he could easily be outranked in all traits of Asperger's himself, and when compared to non-retarded, non-psychopaths with the condition, find himself to be exposed, which is why he keeps a lot of pretentious cretins close to his heart. This is the basis for his standards of loyalty. He's very loyal to those that make him look good by comparison, in the same way so many Jews have befriended Negroids. Far from grasping at straws, we can cite the example of Laura Mulvey, the very sort of neuro-female sociopath that he had derisively moulded me into an object of derision. A licentious whore and slut, harridan, spinster, and closet Marxist who has had a litany of John after John after John. Something about which David had rooted her on for and boasted about, because it's suddenly good for a pseudo-spurg to behave in this way when he would absolutely detest a neurotypical. And he is one. Why am I pandering to his garbage still like it doesn't apply to him? Women for the same. Just absolutely riding that cock carousel. This is the kind of underclass urchin who, like David will soon, has made a litter of future wards of state when she herself would be in a group home had it not been in an ill-fabled care in a community policy, who David surrounds himself in order to act like some sort of deflective shield for his own uncertain standards of conscience, if you like, a mirror upon which David can offload all of his neuroses so as to deny he is anything but merely a king among retards. I'd get the most flack for thesaurus abusage when lifting his fucking work word for word, which is why I started editing them when his doggerel quality scraps of paper were beginning to embarrass me. With its horrible grammar, that he is even dumber than me on a logistic linguistic level is abundantly clear as his fucking daylight praying against society. I don't care how good he is at extrapolating, stealing, and misinterpreting under the pretext of abstrusion the thoughts of others to pass them off as his own, like some sort of jealous Mongolian majestically beholden in awe at the white man's work, enough to kill him and steal his accomplishments. Nor do I feel guilt at doing the same, for that again amounts to hypocrisy on his part. In so many words, what I'm trying to say is that anything deep David supposedly came out with through Otfag was a result of my meticulous recalibration of his words so that they'd be less disjointed. Not completely undisjointed, but still less disjointed. And that you could actually read them and kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. Had you heard what he was saying to me on Skype at the time, you'd also think, this retard raw material without improvement is so rubbish that I don't know why I'm wasting my time stealing his pre-stolen thoughts. David's ideas were only ever good because he was doing the same thing Japan has been doing for years to white inventions. He reverse-engineered neurotypical thought, which is okay because his ego screams to him, it's essentially original, in order to sage any discomfort from knowing they were far beyond a station. Pathetic bastard. Now, seeing as he can't relate to the anger of others very well, and derives false indignation from censure, as though any punishment, verbal, physical, or legal, is the result of an egregious co-conspiracy against him, the onus of which he offloads off his own accountability, he's probably raging right now, but he's so alexithymic that he doesn't realize he's feeling a self-pitying, vengeful aggression about the only way he could relate to how disgusting his prevarications and covert libel against me among his gaggle of retards has been, is to literally be strapped to a chair and have a power drill brutally jammed through his nostrils until it breaks the skull wall, separating the nose from the cranium, dripping with his cold, antisocial blood. Even then, it could only coax a false confession, quite admittedly, but only from the point of view of David, to what is objectively the truth, but is completely divorced from any sincerity on his part. Still, I would think it would satisfy the public's casus belli against him, were they made aware of his perverse ways, with women of incapacity and anybody he finds propitiously utilitarian to his ends. This would be combined with an ideological disarmament campaign, sort of a David's bullshit translator, which would decouple the faux mysticism of his esoteric insights to the real world, very interpersonal motivations behind issuing such diktats, usually all centered around either an Electra or Oedipus complex, to be aggressively inculcated into anyone he has brainwashed. Some people wonder why I even care so much about his babbling, retarded bullshit. Well, it's cogent enough to fool the kind of audience that he contemptuously and disdainfully views as his target. I only liked it for the source material, having actually asked him for a reading list because I know David's teaching was too ineffectual to be of any use, rather than the purported originator or thief of its content. We should show the same ruthlessness in our pursuit of his comeuppance as he has in his pursuit of child-minded rape bait. He's the reason, to this day, that I had attempted suicide, having waded in guilt over using the Otfag as persona for his dubious ends, and that I smoke and drink compulsively to the point of alcoholism and potential lung cancer. All the while, his denial of aggression and reversal of victim and offender tactics work super acrobatically to dissuade him of feeling any responsibility or guilt for perpetrating such morbidity and energetic vampirism against me. He's a mentally deficient Charles Manson, but a street-savvy gangbanger in another life type who has an expertise in the psychology of individuals far exceeding his intelligence, or the level of cognitive empathy usually associated with the condition. So that should be your biggest red flag. He isn't fucking autistic, not by a long shot, unless David wants to change the criteria to include the Nigerian scammers he feels so much private affinity for. I'm done with this fake. He can go procreate his underclass progeny with his defective waifu to be burdensome dregs on the state like he has always been. No, let's just be a bit wishful in our thinking about a just world for a moment. This man should have been castrated before puberty. Fuck, he might have enjoyed the twinkish figure that he ensue from his gelding. enough to be the bottom-feeding sub of whatever Johns he'd attract with that new power of physical persuasion. He has alluded to it time and time again before. His dad is rightfully in jail because he's a scumbag, and I'm sure David's excessive DHT will have him dabbling in criminal elements before long. For shit begats shit. Actually, not to disgrace shit, human scum begats human scum. David will get his yet. He has a massive karmic debt long overdue. I want to compile a symptomal list detailing the full extent of David's psychopathic features, backed up with comprehensive anecdotal accounts of what he's done to evidence that. But this would take me days of work, and I've hardly the time to rush that out in a speedy manner. But it's one of those projects that I wish to get around to someday. Having ran a cursory check of the higher psychopathy checklist, and relating my experiences with David through it, it would only appear he could easily be diagnosed a full-scale psychopath. From what I know about his father, actually, David might be even more psychopathic than the person from whom he inherited those genes. Scary thought, but regression is to a different norm in psychopaths. Each generation gets more dangerous.